And then, of course, it wasn't long until the people started coming out with the study Bibles that had more commentary to them and that kind of thing. But, and they would have topical indexes in them, and they'd have a concordance like that concordance, which is not anywhere near complete, but between the concordance and the topical index, you can find almost any verse that you're thinking of somewhere in one of those two and find the text in the Bible without a whole lot of trouble. And as I said, I found one other study Bible where the center reference columns were really almost that as good as theirs. But and it had a little topical index, and it had a concordance in it, and it was a really super compact paper book-like size, real tiny print. I can't imagine that they didn't, the helps in it weren't published in a bigger print Bible, but I looked for years and I didn't find a big version of it, and I never found another one like it. It was leather bound, so they're bound to have made a bunch of them, but I never could find them. And I looked everywhere for them.
This is something else. Of course, I saw it in some of the, it's highly, the list of highly recommended.
New tab favorites. Favorites. Manage favorites.
This one is, let's see, I know it's the other, from the 70s.
Bible.
1983.
Well, now where's my maps? Here they are. And then I need these guys. Desktop, study Bible, indices, geography, online. Oh, thank you, sir. Turn that over. Well, that's interesting.
No, I have one.
Oh, you do have one?
Yeah, I have one, yeah.
Okay, how do you like it?
I like it, good.
Yeah,
Two of them.
two of them. Okay. I shared this one last week.
My sister gave me one.
Yeah, and I haven't been able to separate myself from it. I can't wait to get home.
That's the way, that's what I ended up, that's the way I feel about this one.
Yeah, that's nifty too.
This one here, man, you start reading it, you don't want to put it down.
Okay.
I ordered one, it's supposed to come in, but it hasn't come in yet.
All right. I see if I did this class the way it really should be done, everybody would have to put up about $150 to take the class. And I'd make you buy each one of these, one edition or another of each one of these major, a good Bible dictionary, a good 1-volume commentary, good atlas, a good Bible customs, good study Bible, and that would be part of the requirement. That you create your own library of 6 or 8 books at a minimum as a part of the class. The reality is I probably ought to fix it so that everybody had to get one of the Bible study programs on their computer or one with an app that they could have on their phone, so they could all learn how to use that and then have all those resources readily available as well.
150, that sounds cheap.
It would press it to be able to buy the 6 or 8 books. It would push you. And I would be able to do that because some of those we could get used books that would be in good enough shape for you to be able to use without any trouble. But it would be a challenge.
So what I found is that the least expensive comes from
Okay, now oh yes.
about $49.
Yeah.
That's the least.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Of course, there was one for $550.
Yeah.
Sure, that's net amount. I don't
Yeah.
think information changes, does it?
No. It's not gonna it'll be, this edition is probably not gonna be significantly changed for a while. Now, when I first started using it, they didn't have the chain numbers in the Old Testament yet. They had the topic titles, but they didn't have the chain, so you go from one verse to the next verse. You had to go back to the back and find out what the next verse was. And I don't know how many years I used that one before I discovered there was a new edition that had the chain all the way through.
This one here is over $54.
Yeah.
It's worth everything.
Oh, yeah.
And then some.
Yeah. Now, of course, I got to buy it back in the days when it was only $35.
And there's no new edition.
Right. Yeah.
This is it.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the last expensive books that I bought. Because the one I had, the atlas that I had and I'd used for years, I had for 15, 20 years. And it was clearly outdated and didn't have near as big a maps in it. So I went overboard on one of those. Anybody else been able to get on here? Cheryl's on, I see. I don't need this one up anymore. Now the question is, am I going to be able to get these back up? Why did that go all the way down on me? Oh, here it is. No, I don't want to end the meeting, but I don't want that up either. There it is. But it's not controlling this. Oh, there it is. There it is. Right on time, huh? Okay. Tonight, we want to look at one of the other major resources for Bible study. And that's a concordance. Now, the Bible Atlas, phone, iPad, geography. Which one of these did I want? Yes. I gave you an excerpt from Bauer's Biblical Resources for Ministry that includes his list of recommended atlases, historical atlases, history, so that you could see those. And I have here a list. I sent you this. I have a list of online resources for atlases. And now let's see if I can go to this new share. This is it here. Here are those various resources. Here is the one at the top, the Google one. And these are set up by book. So you go to the book and you open the chapters, here the Psalms, and they have pictures. They have the satellite imagery. This downloads it. This simply gives you a preview of it, particular site they have in mind. And I've looked at several of these, and I still haven't figured out the logic for what pictures, what sites they show you with what chapter in the Bible. But if you play with this long enough, you might be able to figure that out. This one has a book you can buy, or you can download various maps. This is almost like a Google map, and you can see it's starting to, and then there's this whole series of chronologies that fit in here. And here's the actual image, and then here are the sites marked on it beside it, and it has a whole bunch of other sites. These are all on that list that I sent you. Here is the Bible Atlases, ISV, I think is the way it's the International Standard Version, put together a bunch of maps. And they're on this Bible Hub, which is a good site to have because they do a bunch of other stuff for Bible study. And it's a free site. But you get maps like this. And they're this is one that shows the topographical to some degree. This is one that was created. This is a site with links that were created for teaching. So you can get maps that are blank for to play with. And then, of course, you can get all the maps of various kinds of things. Here's another modern satellite map of Palestine. This one's a downloadable one, the Bible Atlas. This is a site in Austin, and here you get the maps. You have to run them down a little bit. Here there's a list of them in biblical order. Here's a interesting topographic map. And if you had if you had a couple of these sites on your computer, you'd eventually want to make yourself a little index of which topographical map in which of these sites gives you the best vision of what the lay of the land looks like. Now let's see if my if I can get to some of the rest of these, or if my maybe if I do this and I move it over here, I can enlarge it back up and keep it out of here so I can open up the rest of this. Here's a Mormon site that has a bunch of good maps. They're not original with them. They just put these all together for you.
Is there any way you could review the land bridge there as far as the landscape?
Yeah, some of these.
Could you kind of go over it and?
Let me see if I can find a good one for it.
I find that very interesting. I'm not been able to.
There was one that I looked at. Now, where's the one that's? One of these was supposed to be the downloadable one. Huh. Okay, let me see here. Here it is. Did it close? No. Maybe it did. Here's one that you can download on your computer. So you can have all these maps. Here you go. Here's one that shows you the topography as if you had taken a slice, so you're looking at the endwise. Now, does anybody know what place in America is similar to Palestine geologically? You know why the Dead Sea is the deepest place on the face of the earth, lowest place on the face of the earth? Because Palestine is like California. Palestine belongs to the tectonic plate of Africa. This is where two major plates join. This is the rift between the two plates. Palestine doesn't belong geologically to the rest of the Middle East. It belongs to Africa. And this fault line runs all the way down into Africa. So that whole eastern side of Africa doesn't belong to the continent of the rest of Africa. It's like California in reverse. It's attached from the east side, not from the west side. So you get this deep rift. The top of the Sea of Galilee is 1,000+ feet below sea level. If you were to dig a canal from the Dead Sea to the ocean, to the Mediterranean would flow into the Dead Sea. Like it would rush in with 1,000-foot drop. And then the Dead Sea itself is pretty deep. And that rift is runs up, the Jordan River runs down through that rift. The Sea of Galilee sits in that rift, and it runs on up, that rift runs on up into Lebanon, because that whole section of the eastern end of the Mediterranean doesn't belong to the land to the west, to the east. It belongs to the land to the west. And that's why earthquakes are not uncommon, and a little unusual that they're not a whole lot worse than they are, a whole lot more often than they are. And for you prophecy folk, you see, this doesn't make difficult at all some great cataclysmic event happening at the Lord's return. Because he's got two tectonic plates here that he can split apart and send the whole African continent off somewhere with this strip of land hang up there, swash it through the Mediterranean.
On the radio today, we had 3 earthquakes in Texas today.
Yeah. Oh, how about that?
3.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you have this ridge of mountains. They're more like the Appalachians. They're not like the Rockies by any stretch, on both sides. And that's why you have this significant difference in elevation on the western side and on that plateau on the eastern side. Not only then is this geologically a phenomenon, and any place else in the world like this, closest place to it geologically is California.
So they had to go around all that.
Yeah. So you then not only do you have that, but then see you have this situation where you have the Egypt down here, and see Palestine belongs to this. This all belongs to Palestine. This all belongs to Africa. This whole strip of Palestine up into Lebanon, down through the Sinai, and across into Africa. See, this is all one tectonic plate. This rift runs on down into Africa here. So you got this eastern little hump of Africa that belongs to Asia. The rest of Africa belongs to another tectonic plate, which is the vast majority of the continent of Africa and out into the Atlantic Ocean. But you have this being one of the earliest major civilization centers in the world. When Moses lived, the pyramids were already 1,000 years old. That's how early this civilization in Egypt emerges. And that advanced civilization with its technology has to operate with significant commerce and trade, because there are all kinds of elements that this civilization needs that aren't native. And then you have over here in the Mesopotamian valley between the Euphrates River, you have the second major civilization developing. And then, of course, totally independent of this, you have a civilization that develops in China, totally different. But in terms of the Middle East all the way through Europe, these two civilizations flourish long before anything else comes close to building the kinds of cities, the social organization that requires, the agricultural technology that requires, the emergence of metallurgy and the whole development is in these two places. So guess what? Who's in the middle? And you can't come from here to here because this is all barren desert. So even from down here, the trade to Egypt goes up the rivers and crosses over and comes down to Egypt. And Egypt goes up and then comes down. So all of this early civilization is trading through here. This is the center of world civilization. Not in terms of it being the civilizations, but it's where they are constantly bumping heads. They want to control as much of this trade as they can, and they'd really like to control each other, and occasionally they do. More often, Assyria is able to come down and control Egypt, but occasionally Egypt got up and got some control. But they want this interchange between them, and so it's all going through here. And it's a narrow strip. There are not very many routes you can have. You can come down through the river valley, or you can get over the mountains and down toward the rolling plains and the plain. So there's not a whole lot of choices to put routes through here. I mean, you know, if you happen to live on this route, you set up a toll gate and say it's going to cost you to get by here. They don't have a whole lot of options.
Which is the area that we talked about last week where it has increased because they built one on top.
Oh, everything along here. Cities under conflict were destroyed. And once there was a significant amount of fire, even though in this area, there weren't a whole lot of trees, so they used a lot of stone. Even when you've used stone, you got to have wood support to build the roofs and the pillars and hold the walls up, that kind of thing. So when you have a fire, you have significant damage. Well, the simplest way is simply to kind of even it out as best you can, bring in some dirt and fill in the gaps and build another place on top. Trying to clear the debris down to the ground that you had and rebuild is far more complicated. So they just caved it in, filled it up, and built another city on top of it.
They would salvage whatever stone.
Yeah. Whatever was on top that was usable. Fire, of course, messes up rock even. And they would get what they could, but much of it was just buried up and they just build on top of it. Then you had the secondary advantage that now you're higher. So you're a little less easy to attack because now they got to climb up to get to you. And so without a wall, even you got a 10-foot embankment, and pretty soon you got a 20-foot embankment after a few centuries. And so that gives you some advantage. So that's how they did.
So where are the archaeological digs taking place?
All over the place. Yeah. On both sides. Palestine, or the Jews, remember, settled both sides of the Jordan Valley. 2.5 tribes settled over here on the east side. and the others settled over here. And so there are sites being done both ways, both sides. There's controversy over many of those sites as to exactly which place it turns out to be. And the excavation is increasingly controlled so that they lay out a grid and we'll take this square and we'll dig it all the way down. But we won't dig all of it down because in 50 years, they're going to come up with some new archaeological techniques. And so we want them to be able to do just like we did and have untouched material to deal with. So they deliberately will not uncover a whole site. Of course, increasingly they can't do that because it's just too expensive. Pardon?
The walls of Jericho?
Yeah.
That's the latest archaeological.
Yeah, yeah. And within our lifetime, they've completely redone. Let's see if if this one's got one of Jerusalem on it. Before Abraham. Well, are they going to give us one here? Here's some more contours. There's the 12 tribes. Okay, Kingdom of David. I was hoping they'd show us of Jerusalem. Here's one they're calling Zion, but it's hard to make out exactly what they are. Solomon's temple. Here we go. Here's a little better. Here we go. Jerusalem historically was over here. And it's only been within our lifetime that we've begun to realize that the city of David was right here. On this ridge. The city of David, the old Jerusalem, Jebusite city that they conquer, is here. And they expand to the north with the Temple Mount and a palace. And then later on, probably post-exilic, the city begins to expand over into here with any significant size. And so from Jesus' day on, this is the city. And in most studies, you will see this hill here was the original Zion. Even though the title gets switched over to the Temple Mount, so that Zion becomes almost synonymous with the temple area. But it appears that the geographical location was actually this hill over here. And the David's city, Solomon's city, wasn't even over here on Zion. They were over here. And so there's some extensive excavation being done along here that's changed within our lifetime, our understanding of Old Testament Jerusalem. Okay, that's the kind of information that you pick up by working through all this stuff. And some of this stuff, of course, you see, is not the kind of thing that you would just stumble across in looking up something about the place. It's, you're using your atlas not just to look up something when you want to look up something. You're reading some of the things they tell you about this land and its locations and its places. So you find out this information that then constantly creeps up in your reading of the scripture. Oh, that makes sense now that this is there, that kind of thing. The movement of Jesus in and out of Jerusalem becomes a little more sensible when you have a good view of the geography that's involved. The study of the book of Judges is kind of difficult if you don't have a good atlas close by to see where these things are happening. And when you do that, then it's easier to see that some of these people were probably contemporaries with each other. The stories are told in sequence, but they're actually overlapping chronologically because one's here and one's clear up there. They're not even close to each other. Geographically, they may have not even hardly known about each other. And it's a little bit difficult for us to conceive that because we have the vision of this whole group of people coming in together, and they all have the temple, the tabernacle, and then the temple that they regularly come to. And so there's not any social separation. But when you read the book of Judges with a series of maps in your hand, then you can begin to see that it's not impossible at all that these two guys who judgeships were contemporary would not have hardly even known about each other, because the tabernacle in Judges is rarely mentioned. And when you get to Samuel, you realize that it's not a central place at all for a lot of people. All the people aren't going to wherever the tabernacle is 3 times a year for the feasts. It's the story it's just not that central a place. You have real tribes. And so when you read the story that the people get unhappy with something that some of the Benjamites do, and they go and nearly wipe out the whole tribe of Benjamin, it's not hard to imagine that when you're seeing this in its geographical setting. To see a civil war that almost takes out one is not so hard. When you can see that aspect from its geography.
And there was no room, everyone did what
Yeah,
they thought was
right, yeah.
Now for none.
So when you have a chance, take this list of sites and play with them over various times. Find yourself one or more of these that really has some good maps. Make it one of your favorites so you can get to it in a hurry and look up some of these features. And that way you can constantly refresh in your mind what the land kind of looked like and in its geology and its topography. And you can see the relationships of the various areas. And you have something you can quickly refer to. It's always there. If you, in the process, have the money to spend on a pretty good atlas, add it to your library. So it's there, so to grab and look at right quick. What is this? Where is it? What was around it? and look at it. Okay. Let's take a new share here. And I think that's, no, that's not what I wanted. I may want to bring it back up again. What I wanted, new share. No, that's the same one. Well, now I'm having the same problem we had last week. I know it's open because I opened it. And it's not showing. Online Bible Atlas, geography.
Mr. Platt, can I say something? I don't have Palestine on my map. Is it right there in Jerusalem?
No, Palestine is the name given to the land as a whole. The whole area of Bible land. When the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 134 AD 134, they killed a lot of Jews. They deported a lot of Jews. They rebuilt the city of Jerusalem as a Roman city and banned the Jews from going there, even certainly living there. And they renamed the area, the whole lands, that whole eastern end of the Mediterranean, they renamed it Palestine. And that's how we got the name. So it's not technically a biblical name. And it covers this whole region from Lebanon down to the Sinai Peninsula. And it covered originally, of course, both sides of the Jordan River. Now, see what happened in the modern setting is that the United Nations cut out this little hunk here and gave it to the Jews as a Jewish homeland. They didn't include any of the land on the west side, on the east side of the Jordan. And they only included a sliver. They gave them the coastline in, but they didn't even give them to the Jordan River. So what today the Palestinians are actually these people right in here, that most of this land over here was set up under the country of Jordan with a king. So the Palestinians end up being the people left out. And so they end up with this a narrow strip on the eastern side of the Jordan River, and then a narrow strip on the western side of the Jordan River that wasn't given to Israel.
They ended up with that
That was the United Nations that creates the modern country of Israel. And they drew the boundary from the coast in toward, but see, they didn't even include Jerusalem. The Jews were given a quarter, a section of Jerusalem that they could inhabit. But they weren't even given the whole city. And everything to the east of there was retained by the Muslim peoples who were already living there.
Little by little, they're being pushed.
And Israel, of course, is constantly invading that area in terms of building settlements.
So that right there at the border of the green zone and the purplish area, so is that what it's called, the Gaza Strip?
No, the Gaza Strip is down here. The Gaza Strip is down here along the coastline
Okay.
southward.
You can see it here on that map. That view.
Uh,
Yeah, okay.
It's right there, right down the bottom.
Here's the city of Gaza.
On the water.
And the strip then is this land along here that again, Palestinians were allowed to keep, even though the major part of this land to the south onto the Sinai Peninsula is retained by Egypt. And then in the agreements that have happened since the last 25 years or so, Israel has been given more control of this southern area, areas of it. But most of the Sinai is still Egyptian, not Palestinian, not Jewish. So that most of the traditional Bible sites of the New Testament, for instance, are not in Israel, in Galilee. Some of them are. But anything on the east side of the Jordan, that's in Jordan. Or in the Palestinian area. And since they've been hostile to each other all this time, rarely can you move from one side to the other side. Now you can do that a little more freely on occasion than you used to could, but for many years you couldn't do it at all. In order to get from Jordan to the east side and from Jerusalem to the east side of the Jordan River, you had to go to Jordan or fly back to Beirut or something, and then fly back in to cross the river. It was just too disagreeable. Is this map still showing, Cheryl?
No.
Okay, that's what I was afraid of. And I moved this away because this list I don't want. There's another, okay, let's stop that share and let's start a new share. And there's one that's not showing like it did last week.
Isn't it kind of interesting how you're talking about the Jews, how it seems like you're always pushing them, the Jews, like even the Holocaust?
Yeah.
That's kind of interesting.
No, it is too what I wanted. Okay, maybe I can get it yet. Here we go. Is this list showing?
It says like names, location, topography.
Yeah, right. That's what we wanted.
Okay.
When you're dealing with geography, there are several different things for you to be concerned about, interested in terms of the sites themselves, and then in terms of the Bible study. The first issue, of course, is names. And that's not always a simple thing, because frequently they will have multiple names. Same place, and at different times in the Bible, it has different names. The one that's most curious about that, for instance, is the Sea of Galilee. Don't be surprised when you read about a different place, but it sounds like the Sea of Galilee. Well, they called it by a different name at various times. And so in several places in the New Testament, you have the Sea of Gennesaret. Well, it's the same place. Frequently, you will even find a term, a name being used for a place that it sounds like they're talking about this place and this is its name, but because of what they're talking about, the story that relates to it, that name is never used anywhere with reference to that place. So you can't be sure what that name is. Is it some kind of a place name? Was it a popular reference to some part of the place? The famous passage about Bethlehem of Ephrata. Well, what's Ephrata? And that's, especially with Old Testament names. Remember, you're dealing with nearly 1,000 years of history from the Genesis story to Ezra and Nehemiah, and certainly to the New Testament time, 500 years later. So don't be surprised when you find confusion, which the sources that you read, Bible dictionary, an atlas, may not agree as to what the significance of these two titles are. And the most unusual one of that is in the book of Exodus, Numbers, and Leviticus, the site where the law is given, where Israel builds the tabernacle, is always called Sinai. In Deuteronomy and Joshua judges Samuel, it's Horeb. Now, was one of those the mountain range and the other one of the peaks in that mountain range? Is one of them the mountain and the other one the peak on the mountain?
That's understandable because the culture back then, they may have called it that name, and then as time went on,
Yeah.
then they changed the name.
Yeah. Yeah. You have the interesting feature in Samuel where Samuel is introduced as a prophet, and then there's the parenthetical expression. They used to be called seers, but now they're called prophets. That doesn't always happen. We get what must be the same thing happening, but the Bible writer doesn't clue us in that that's what happened, like they do there. So when you're looking for sites, don't be surprised if you've got a name that has been associated with more than one site. And don't be surprised when you get more than one name associated with the same site. And don't be surprised when you run into different discussions about the archaeology of a site and you discover that there's one guy who thinks it's this tell that we've excavated, and another one thinks, no, it's this one over here. And you've got the wrong place. And maybe one of these days we'll find the gate that has the name on it,
Yeah,
and we'll know.
But were they not able to tell because supposedly the tells were arranged in such a way that only certain materials will be in this tell, and then another type of material would be.
Well, not necessarily. There's not usually that clear a distinction of the materials from one city to the next, unless there's a significant difference in population. A Palestinian city could be close to a Jewish city, and their pottery and metallurgy and so forth might be pretty different. But two Palestinian cities are going to have pretty much the same kind of stuff.
I think even some of the gates, I think there was only like 3 basic patterns of the gates to the cities, that a lot of them were similar.
Yeah, yeah.
The gates.
So unless they got the name inscribed on it somewhere, you see, the fact that you got this gate and the place, and one of those places in the Bible, you know, they talk about the gate of Ekron or whatever the name of the city was, you know. So you're at this location and you discover this monster gate and it fits the description of the Bible. Oh, this is that place. Well, not necessarily, because nearby town may have had a similar gate.
Well,
So
they took the gate.
yeah, and who knows, you know? So you've got this whole issue of certain grain of salt you have to keep in mind when you're dealing with these things. And that's true of almost down to the detail. I have friends who frequently traveled to Palestine, and they're just enthralled with the tomb of Jesus, because there's a tomb found close by the site that kind of looks like it would fit the description of Golgotha. And there's all kinds of arguments about that site as to whether it's inside or outside the gate. And of course, that depends on which period of time you've got the wall and all kinds of issues there. Who knows? I read an article several years ago about the fascinating, quote, underground archaeology in Jerusalem. And it's not just underground in its metaphorical sense, it's underground in real sense. People buy property for the deliberate reason that they believe this is the site of something in the time of Jesus or the Middle Ages or David or whatever their point is. And they buy this house or this building deliberately so they can secretly excavate below it into layer after layer after layer. And they're not letting professional archaeologists in because they want to have full control over what they find. And so there are people who have major productions going on underneath their house. And only their closest friends may know about it because of the site. Topography, environment, frequently will give you some features that are meaningful. Is this a high place, a low place? What kind of weather do they have? What times of the year? A whole separate issue involves the inhabitants of this place, who lived here, when, the history of those people and other people who came around them. This all connects with, of course, the archaeology, and there are whole books about the archaeology. Some of them are written from an apologetic standpoint, so they're talking about sites that prove, quote, this or that feature, story, event in the Bible is as it's described because we've got the supporting archaeological evidence. Others are simply interested in introducing you to what we know about the inhabitants, how they lived, what kind of crops they grew, what kind of technologies they had, how did they make their clay, how did they do their grapes, this kind of stuff. And that will often interface with a story. For instance, what's the custom story with harvest in the book of Ruth?
Threshing floor.
Pardon? The threshing floor, one thing, and the which? The gleaning, during which the poor are allowed to pick up what is dropped.
That was because of David. That was
Well, it's actually goes all the way back to Moses.
Was it what was dropped or what was?
What was dropped? No, what is dropped? And the corners were supposed to be left completely, but anything you dropped was supposed to be left for them too. Now, I grew up in farmland where we still used threshing machines. And I could not imagine how you would drop much. I mean, you grab a whole hunk of wheat and you cut it off with a sickle. And you've got an armload of stalk and head, 1.5 feet, 2 feet long. How often are you going to drop that? Well, it turns out they didn't harvest that way. They grabbed the head and cut off right below it.
They only took the ear part.
They only took the ear part
Yeah,
and no more stock than they needed to keep from cutting themselves.
yeah.
Well, now you got a handful, and now trying to put 2 handfuls together and stack them, it's much easier to drop something just because of the particular custom. So that's a whole different area that comes in after we look at geography. But it's this kind of stuff that builds in here. In terms of the Bible, you're interested in this site for what part does it play? Understanding why the battle was fought here. Why things happened in this place. And when you see the geography, when you see that this city sits in the valley between 2 rocky mountains, and the mountains extend both ways, and there's not much of a way to get from anywhere south of here to anywhere north of here, anywhere from Egypt to Assyria, except through here, it's pretty obvious why this town keeps getting caught in the middle. Why the armies from this side and the armies from that side are always going through here. And it's a little easier to see the opposite, why there could be this exchange between Assyria and Egypt, even sometimes in conflict, and yet Jerusalem is not directly affected because it's not sitting on the round. It's sitting up here in the mountains. Unless Jerusalem is going to try to interdict your supply lines and mess with you, you don't need to mess with it. There's nothing to be gained by just taking this city. I mean, what are you going to do with it? You don't need it. You can extract some taxes from it or whatever, but there's no reason to waste your manpower to take it, because it would take quite a bit to get to this place on the hill. It's on the top of the hill. You're going to lose a lot of soldiers trying to take this place. Why bother? You don't need it. It's clear off to the side here. It's not in your way. And then it makes it a little more inexplicable why a Jewish king would bother to inject himself in this conflict. when, you know, they're perfectly willing to leave him alone. But for whatever reason, he decides that he wants to take part in this. So what is the place that this plays in the history of the Bible? Most of your study Bibles will have the maps of the travels of Jesus, and you can see him moving around through Galilee, coming up and down. Although there's an interesting thing for you to look at in terms of geography. Traditionally, let me see if I can bring a map back up. This will work, I think. Yeah. Traditionally, and to this day, they usually hype it. Jesus is understood to have been baptized down here. So the stories are he comes all the way from Galilee down the east side, couple of days journey to be baptized. Us people who believe in immersion baptism of sort, we can really make hay out of this. Turns out now there's significant evidence that John wasn't baptizing down here, he was baptizing up here. And one of the strong pieces of evidence is that this is the area that the Christians escaped to from Jerusalem when Jerusalem is destroyed. And there's a major exodus of Christians who believe what Jesus said, when you see the sign, the abomination, you get out. And so they did.
Those were the ones that listed in the prophets.
Yeah. And they come up here. And those this view explain they're coming up here because this is the traditional place of the ministry of John and the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. So even something as solid as the quote baptism of Jesus geographically, we find out when you do a little digging, and of course it'll depend on which geographer you read, which historian you read, as to which of these views he even presents, let alone gives you both views and says, well, you know, there is this theory, I don't buy it, or I'm not sure there's enough evidence for it, or discounts it entirely because he takes the other view, or she. There are a whole lot of ladies in archaeology. So a lot of work you read are going to be from women. What's going on? From a geographical standpoint, you see, makes far more sense for Jesus to have come from Galilee, crossed the Jordan River, mile or two or so down the river, to meet John and be baptized. And then there's the additional feature. See if I can get us back without too much trouble. Is it this one? Yes. What place is made of this what use is made of this place in the Bible itself, besides just telling about it when it's involved in persons' lives or events? Does the Bible use this place? For instance, in the prophets, even though God's going to carry Israel, Judah, into Babylon, the prophets frequently talk about this impending doom as a return to Egypt, where they were slaves, captives, and from which God had to extradite them later on. And you'll find that even of a single city or single location. What does the Bible make of this place? Do they almost turn it into a metaphor of good or evil? To whom does Peter write his letter? I'll turn to 1 Peter and see to whom he writes his letter. Anybody got your Bible handy?
1 Peter?
Yeah, 1 Peter.
It just says that these strangers in the world scattered throughout Tunis and Nazareth, Egypt.
I'm remembering wrong, I guess.
It doesn't, John or Peter?
No, I'm pretty sure it was Peter that I'm thinking about.
Well, he wrote to the exiles that were scattered.
Okay. Well, the sites there would be worth looking at. Where are those places?
Jerusalem, regions of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia Minor, and
yeah.
Bithynia.
Well, sorry, folks, my memory failed me. I wasn't.
It says that he was writing to the dispersed Christians.
Yeah, writing, and then he gives you a bunch of locations. But I was thinking that either he put his place
It says that it was written to, according to chain, or to the constant chain, to the elect scattered throughout Asia Minor, probably to the whole body of Christians in that region, both Jews and Gentiles, to the churches largely founded by Paul. Peter sent this spiritual message of encouragement, instruction, and admonition. And it was written for the purpose of to tell them to obey the commands of Jesus. That's what I like about this Council chain.
yes.
You see right there.
Okay.
also to encourage and strengthen the brothers to think of like God. And of course, the key word is suffering.
Oh, I'm mistaken about the greeting. It's at the end of the letter.
It's the what?
End of the letter. 1 Peter 5:13. And it's not to, it's from. Your sister church in Babylon. How would you assume that? And that he's not writing from Mesopotamia, that he's over in the east. The city of Babylon was not in meaningful existence in Peter's day. The site was still known, but it had long since been destroyed as a city. So is he making a reference to a geographical place by its old name in Mesopotamia? Or is he writing this letter from Rome, the capital city of the great biblical empire of the Old Testament?
I've read somewhere where the majority of the population of Rome were Jewish.
Not anywhere near the major. There were a bunch there, but not anywhere close to a major. Rome was way too big a city to have had that kind of a presence of Jews. There were a significant number, but it was remember in the book of Acts, there's the mention of the time that they are excluded from the city. Ananias and Sapphira meet Paul in Corinth, Ephesus, because they've been exiled from Rome. So they weren't any huge majority, any huge number that Rome could not pretty easily make sure they sent out of town, made them get out of town, and they stayed out at least for a while. And there are other instances of this kind of thing where a Bible word becomes a Bible name, place, becomes a figure for what God did there, or what some person did there, or for what happened there. What's the most common place in the Bible where the name of the place is used as a figure, and it's for bad things?
It's for what?
Bad things.
Nazareth?
No. Old Testament site. Early Old Testament story. Place becomes a bad name.
Sodom.
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 Or Sodom and Gomorrah. Or Gomorrah by itself sometimes is used. But Sodom certainly, you see, becomes a name of a place that enters the language with all kinds of metaphorical uses. So in your study of places, this is one of the things to become familiar with. Now, the real fun about the places, of course, is how do we say their names? And for that, you need to have an atlas, Bible dictionary that has a good pronunciation code that you can use that makes sense to you. So you don't have to struggle with, oh, this is where the accent is. This is the long A versus the all A. This is an I as an I and not an E sound, and those kinds of things. And most of them nowadays are pretty easy to read. They don't give you a whole lot of different symbols. And so but you need to become adept with at least one of them. So you can very quickly learn how the preferred pronunciation of this place is. And in pronunciations, you have that fascinating problem you have anytime you have translation issues. The accents frequently will shift. Old Testament names that have an I in them are many times, in Hebrew, it's a Y sound. When it got translated into Greek and then it was brought into Latin and into the English language, it turns out to be an I sound. And so frequently in English, you end up with a diphthong, an EI, an IA, an IE, or even an IU occasionally. And we may run it together and so you end up with one syllable because the vowels are put together. Whereas in Hebrew, it was two vowels and that I was a Y. So it was a Y sound. So don't be surprised, especially now with computers, you will frequently have the thing built into your computer system where you can have this name sounded out for you. And you may find that gliding. You may have noticed, those of you, nearly all you are bilingual, the interesting feature we have with you, like Emmanuel. How do you say that in Spanish? Emmanuel in Spanish. The U gets almost turned into a W. And so you end up with one less syllable. There are a whole lot of words, Bible words, that from Spanish to English, you have that problem. And you'll end up having the same problem when you go back. So you may find differences in how this name should be pronounced. And frequently that will be a matter of whether this person is following British English as opposed to American English, or whether they are more closely trying to follow the Hebrew or the Greek as opposed to the English. The famous God of the Old Testament, B-A-A-L. In English, we almost put that together as a glide, and it's Ba. In Hebrew, it's two syllables because there's a consonantal sound between them. Was one of those letters that they quit using the sound for. And so by the time it got to Greek, there wasn't a letter to put there because there was no sound being said there that you could really distinguish. And so you ended up with two vowels side by side. Well, in English, there's no way to say those separately, really. But we just don't do that in English much. And so you end up with a one-syllable word. Ba. And place names are really bad with that. Personal names are that way some, but the place names are much worse in terms of how this gets transmitted from Hebrew or Greek, Aramaic into English, and see there's a long history through Latin with nearly all of that. So it gets to be pretty fascinating. Okay.
Getting back to the places, in the Old Testament, the New Testament, what have you, for years and years and years, I struggled with the gates of hell. I could never understand that.
Now,
And then I sort of learned to study that it was an actual location, the gates of hell, where Jesus took the prophets to show them, he walked over there with them, and showed them, you know, the place that was referred to as the gates of hell, where they would throw the little kids into sacrifice, the little babies into sacrifice.
It's still a figure.
It's still there.
Still a figure. Even the geographical place outside Jerusalem, Gehenna, didn't have gates to it. It was just the garbage dump. And it became that because it was the place in the Old Testament, it's Gehenna, and gay is the word for what? Valley, I think, and it was Hinnom. The location was Hinnom, so it's Gehenna. And that's simply the place where the Jewish God, he wasn't a Jew, they weren't Jews yet, the Judite, the king of Judah, sets up a sacrifice place where, among other victims, there were children. And there's still some debate as to what actually happened. Whether the children were actually thrown into a fire and burned up, or whether children were simply passed over or through the fire.
Come over where they had worship like for the god of Pan, and the king, another king had put his place there. They had a goat and a ram, and the water would come out from the rock, the water would come out from the cave, and they would go there and throw children in there to feed these gods.
I'm not aware there was a location like that in Palestine. I'd have to look that up.
It says Gehenna is a place of state of misery. That's number 2 translation, hell sense.
Yes, but there you're dealing with the more metaphorical sense. Originally, it was a geographical place. And it becomes a cursed place because kings like Manasseh have sacrificed to other gods at that location. And Josiah desecrates the place by a whole liturgy of activities. And it becomes then the literal garbage dump. But now remember, you're talking about by Jesus' day, which is 500 years later, and the Jews were gone from there for 70 of those years. So you don't have an easy transition from one to the other to the other. But then in Aramaic, it becomes Gehenna. And it's that place which then Jesus and apparently the Jews before him have turned into this metaphor for the eternal punishment of people. The place forsaken by God. Jesus uses the term a couple of times in the Gospels. Which in terms of the pure language of English then becomes hell. And that's distinguished from those places in the Bible that use the Greek word for the place of the dead, Hades. And there's been extensive theological development of those terminologies and their meanings through the centuries. So that the traditional view is that Hades is the temporary place the dead go until the resurrection. And then, of course, it depends entirely on what your theory about the return of Jesus is, to what transpires in the resurrection and how many there are and all those issues. And then hell becomes the eternal place where Satan and all of his allies are thrown, and everybody who doesn't get to go to heaven with Jesus. And there are all kinds of issues with every aspect of that, depending on what your view of end times is. Okay, any other question about places and learning to use some of these geographical tools? Connected with this, as we mentioned, is the history that takes place at these places, the peoples that are involved. And so we'll look at that next week. You already have a bibliography of some of those books of history. I'll give you a modified, on there, some sites to be able to look to, especially for the issues of chronologies, and especially for the chronologies of the kings of Israel, particularly when they become divided, and how do you put the prophets in there. And it's good for you to have resource to that history and the chronology, so you can more quickly relate which prophet is preceding and following, and that kind of thing. We'll look at history, and then the last section of materials that we'll look at are those that deal in a broad way with the cultures, the pottery, the tools, the methods, the foods, the clothing, the houses, that kind of stuff, and where you can find that information fairly readily. Most of this information from here on, of course, any specific feature, item, place, person, event, you're going to be able to find in a good Bible dictionary, good Bible encyclopedia, at least briefly presented. And all of those, just like the Atlas and Archaeology with it, there are some worthwhile books to know about if, for whatever reason, you really want to get serious about the Philistines or the Moabites or the Jebusites or whatever. There are some sources where they've done some pretty extensive studies, pulled together various monographs that have been written, doctoral thesis that was done here or there by somebody about this. So if you want to really delve, the Samaritans that we've mentioned, which, as far as I'm concerned, have a real problematic existence in the New Testament. You need to know some places that you could go look and see what's being done with those topics. Didn't hold you over, but about, 9 minutes this time? Maybe by the end, I'll get you out on time.
That's all right. That's all right.
Okay. Robert's here.
Yeah.
Marshall's online. Gloria's here.
Yeah, I spent some time with her this weekend.
Cheryl's online.
Mountains
And Onesimus is here. Thank you all for hanging in with us.
That is very interesting.
Can't hear you. Book of Ruth? Well, because you're dealing with a much smaller piece, it's easier to drop. And once you drop it, you're not supposed to pick it back up. Now, theoretically, you see, cutting it, it would not be easy to drop because you've got a handful and you cut it, you got a good hold on it. It's when you start trying to put that handful together with some others, how do you put, where do you lay this? Where do you put this? And you're not dealing with a long stock that's kind of easy to keep hold of. It's a much more complicated item that it's easier to drop. Talking about what? Yeah, because see, when I was doing it as a kid, you were cutting it down at the ground. So you had a long stock. So the rake could come along behind you, or when you gathered it in, you had a long stock. Most of the time we did it, of course, what you did was go in and cut it with a mechanical sickle, and then you'd rake it. And the rake would fold it over, and then you'd come along and you grab a whole big bundle of it and wrap it together, tie it together, and stand it up. And then you come along with the wagon, throw them up on the wagon, then you take it to the thrashing machine. Well, you don't drop many that way, because it's pretty hard to drop one that way. And I'm thinking, you know, that's not going to help the poor much. Yes. Okay. Okay. You vetted him that we can trust him.
I'll vouch for him.
Good night.
Thank you for another wonderful class.
You're welcome.